in western Pennsylvania, just like in New York and Washington, D.C., it was a beautiful day. The sky was bright blue with no cloud cover at all. The morning air was cool, and the leaves were just starting to become a little dry, but they hadn't yet started to fall. It was a typical Tuesday. Our students, who are now alumni, were getting ready to head to their first classes of the day. Nothing was different until 8:46 that morning. Then the North Tower of the World Trade Center was hit, and what had been typical was turned upside down. The nation was stunned, and our lives changed forever. In 2001, some members of our current freshman class had yet to be born. Many of our graduate students were in elementary school. So think back, maybe just try to imagine. Maybe you were having breakfast at daycare, or were in the middle of a reading lesson when suddenly your day was interrupted with this confusing news that passenger airplanes were being used to attack our country. Maybe your parents or your teachers cried. Maybe some tried to explain what was happening. And I bet a few of you were dismissed early when a parent signed you out of school. Or maybe you stopped the class you were teaching as the word spread and you sent your students home. After all, no one knew that day that the horror would stop after the plane went down in Shanksville. Many people were certain more would come. In the afternoon, after the carnage ended, you couldn't see any trace of air traffic in the skies. You couldn't hear the engine of even a small plane. The Federal Aviation Commission had commanded all planes to land, and the sky was silent. And I'm sure that in your household, like in mine, all the adults were glued to the telephone and television, desperate for as much information as they could find. They needed to learn about friends and relatives who might have been caught up in the day's events. The 2,977 victims came from 115 different nations. They ranged in age from 2 to 85. The death toll included 3 of our alumni, Donald Jones, William Moskal, and William Sugra. That day changed the world's political and economic landscape with reverberating effects that have affected millions upon millions of people. September 11 represents some horrific statistics. 343 paramedics and firefighters and 60 police officers perished. 3,051 children lost a parent that day. 20% of all Americans knew someone who was hurt or killed on September 11. One of the subsequent military actions was Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. 2,343 U.S. troops died. In New York, 146,100 people lost their jobs because of the destruction, and the economic loss on the city in the next month was $105 billion. From the cleanup in New York alone, nearly 2 million tons of debris were hauled from lower Manhattan, taking more than 3 million person-hours. Thanks to the Kowalczyk family, one small section of the World Trade Center made its way here to IUP, and it serves as a lasting reminder. For all the fear, loss, heartache, and destruction, the sorrow that resulted, and difficult as it may be to believe, we can find some positive. I remember, and perhaps you remember, that patriotism soared. We have become more vigilant for our own safety, and while that sometimes seems like a burden, it's an improvement. Back then, bickering in Washington ceased for a bit. And in many ways, our society became more globally aware. As an example, applications to the Peace Corps rose by 40% in the following year. And right here at IUP, we've gathered to remember all that happened every year since. In the very first gathering, the Oak Grove was filled from the library to Oakland Avenue. So I encourage you to make this anniversary count. Find a deed that does good and dedicate it to those we lost that day. On June 13th, 2014, I stood on the grounds of the National September 11 Memorial and Museum, right at Ground Zero. The new One World Trade Center building, sometimes called the Freedom Tower, was in the final stages of construction, and you've probably seen pictures of it or maybe been there. I spent my time at the north and south pools. Each pool fills what was the foundation of one of the twin towers. At the center of each pool, water falls into a seemingly bottomless hole. And surrounding each pool are bronze plaques listing the names of all people killed in the September 11 attacks. I located those for Donald Jones, Bill Moskal, and Bill Sucre. And I stood and I contemplated the lives of these three members of this IUP family whom I'll never meet. Because, as the stone marker says, may we never forget.